Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Today we welcome back a special guest, Mike Goldstein, Managing Director of the Center for Higher Education Transformation at Titan Partners. Mike is a pioneer in the development of the legal environment in higher education and a counselor at the highest levels of legislation in higher education. He founded the law firm Dow Loans in 1978, which merged into Cooley in 2014, and was a senior partner there for 7 years before joining Titan about 3 years ago. Mike joins us today to discuss the regulatory changes from the department that are affecting mergers and acquisitions, along with a few tidbits about the new negotiated rulemaking that will be impacting accreditors and state authorization. Mike, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you, Drumm. It's really a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to have a good conversation with you, my friend. We're going to talk about mergers. And there's a lot going on. We all know there's overcapacity with higher ed. There's not enough students. We're seeing far more merger activity. But before we get into that, if you wouldn't mind giving folks just a little bit of background, why you're an expert in this area.
Well, I don't know whether the answer is why I'm an expert, but the background is that I've been involved in higher education and innovation in higher education for many decades. I was an administrator at the University of Illinois, Chicago in its formative years as one of the first new breed of comprehensive urban public institutions, University of Illinois in Chicago, and developing an institution that was focused on how does it serve multiple communities and multiple constituencies simultaneously, while being true to the concept of providing a high-level, high-quality, accessible education. I moved on to that, to leading the education practice at a large Washington law firm, which we then merged into a large global firm, Cooley, and dealing with the very rapidly evolving regulation of higher education, substantially through the Title IV student aid programs, but also significantly through changes in both accreditation and state regulation that I think over the years has made higher education perhaps the most highly regulated industry in the United States. And most recently, I'm a managing director at the firm Titan Partners, which is a unique mix of a investment banking firm that is intimately coupled with a strategic advisory. So we work both with doing M&A, but also in providing very sophisticated analysis, not just to institutions, but to other entities such as the Gates Foundation that are major players in the education space. And I have the pleasure of serving as a chair of a small college up in northern Vermont College of Fine Arts. And I've been for many years a trustee of the Fielding Graduate University in California.
Which just happens to be my alma mater.
Well, and which explains a lot.
I don't know if that's good or bad. I think it's good, but
I think it's very good.
Thank you. You've been involved with a lot of mergers over your years in doing this. Can you talk a little bit about them and, to provide a baseline context to what's going on in the industry with mergers and acquisitions?
Well, there have always been mergers in higher education, and whether you call it a merger or an acquisition is really semantic. You're taking two institutions and you're pouring them into one. And the distinction is in part, what does the remaining institution look like? What name is it using? How much has the other institution remained visible? And there are models where the two institutions remain clearly visible, but they're under a common leadership, a common model. There are models where they become undifferentiated. A very interesting example is the Parsons School of Design in New York and the New School for Social Research. They were independent institutions for a great many years. Different models. Parsons, a very distinguished design school, one of the finest in the country. The New School, one of the most innovative, progressive post-secondary institutions in the United States with a focus on social impact. They merged. They became the New School's Parsons, or Parsons the New School, depending upon how you read it. They became a single institution, but again, retained a distinctive character for each of their elements, but they were poured into a single mold. Another model was New York University acquiring control of New York Polytechnic University. NYU, one of the largest, richest universities in the United States, up until the 1970s, had a large, if not terribly distinguished, engineering school. It sold that to the City University of New York, which has developed it quite nicely. And then in recent years, they made the judgment that they're really missing a significant part of their curriculum. They were very strong in the sciences, extremely strong in mathematics with the Quran Institute, but didn't have an engineering program. And they felt this particularly in computer sciences. New York Polytechnic Institute, which originally was Brooklyn Poly and then changed its name, was a very well-established, excellent engineering school at a level below MIT, but not far below. And New York University acquired control of New York Poly, but did not merge it, did not merge it into NYU at the point of acquisition. It kept it as a separate institution with its own board, albeit a board that was now controlled by New York University. And that went on for about 5 years. And then at the end of that time, NYU merged New York Poly into NYU and renamed it, as a result of a multi-$100-million gift from a donor, into the Tandon School of Engineering of New York University. So it remains a named institution, but now operationally fully merged into NYU. So those are our models. But a not uncommon model is a school that is having difficulty sustaining itself. It can't maintain its campus. Its enrollment has dropped. Simply merging into another institution so as not to vanish from the face of the earth. And there are a lot of those models, particularly among smaller liberal arts institutions. And there's no question that we are overpopulated with small, undifferentiated liberal arts institutions. The overpopulation is a result partly of new institutions arising and partly simply a demographic shift, that the number of 18 to 22-year-olds is dropping and dropping rapidly. The number of college-age students who are electing to go to college is flattening out. And that's separate and apart, the proportion, that's separate and apart from the absolute numbers. And that has enormously stressed all private institutions, tuition-dependent institutions. And the way the institutions have made up for this old aphorism in retail trade, you lose money on every sale and make it up in volume, they have increasingly reduced the actual tuition. And that is, they've taken the base tuition and then given a increasingly large proportion of students a discount. I'm not talking about federal student aid. I'm talking about straight institutional discounts. They call them scholarships, but they're simply discounts, to which at today, the average nonprofit institution discounts in excess of 55% of its standard rate. That means if their tuition is $15,000 a year, they are actually collecting on average $7,500, and that includes federal student aid. Mm-hmm. So the economic model for operating institutions has become increasingly stressed, which has encouraged the merger and acquisition process among nonprofit institutions. Now, there's always been an M&A with regard to for-profit schools because primarily they have been owned by private equity, and private equity owners have a timeline for the funds that they use to acquire, and that is that they need to cash out the funds in anywhere between 5 and 8 years, and that essentially establishes a churn. The other thing that's happened is that many for-profit institutions were family owned, and there is the generational issue of the founder aging out and the family, the children saying, this is wonderful, but that's not what we want to do. And they've come up on the market. Mm-hmm. And finally, there's been the movement of for-profit institutions from being owned privately, either by private equity or by families, becoming publicly traded, and then going out of being publicly traded, either back to private equity or what's happening increasingly now, and the University of Phoenix, a very good example of a school that was privately held, became publicly traded, went back to being privately held, and is now in the process of being acquired by a large state university, the University of Idaho.
Mm-hmm. So that's a really great baseline for what's been going on in the industry. Now we throw in a new wrinkle. There's new guidance that came out middle of last year. It's funny to say middle of last year because I still think it's 2023 and it's actually 24. But there's new guidance that came out from the department that is regulating the merger, the acquisition pieces more than it has been. Can you go into that a little bit, please?
Yeah, it's actually 2021. I have eliminated the pandemic years completely.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, and that means we can take 3 or 4 years off of our age. Does that work too?
Absolutely. And you're looking better already.
Thank you. You too.
I want to correct one thing. It's not guidance. What the Department of Education did last year is it promulgated regulations that significantly change the manner through which the department processes institutional mergers or acquisitions.
A change of ownership.
A change of ownership. And the language needs to be clear. Change of ownership or control.
Right.
And the reason that's important is that a nonprofit institution is not owned by anyone. Mm-hmm. It's, in theory at least, it's a public good. But it's controlled by a board. It's controlled by people.
Right.
So the term is ownership or control. And they promulgated regulations that go into effect on July 1. And they have issued some further guidance in terms of initial interpretation. They also have a new rulemaking that is now actually underway that is speaking specifically to accreditation and state authorization, and also going to the issue of ownership and control and changes of ownership and control of all institutions, for-profit, nonprofit, and public. And there's a lot of detail there, and there's been a lot written on what these regulations say and do and why they're good, bad, burdensome or otherwise. And whether they're good or bad, they're certainly more burdensome. There are more steps. There is a longer timeline. Many, many more trees are going to be killed in the process of applying for and getting approvals. But I think what we've neglected is a conversation about why these regulations are being promulgated. What is the federal government, the Department of Education, seeking to accomplish with these regulations? It used to be, the abiding assumption was that all of this is aimed at crushing for-profit higher education. And one can make a pretty good argument that there was a significant sense in the Department of Education, certainly under Democratic administrations, and certainly during the Obama administration and now in the Biden administration, that for-profit higher education is, I'll be charitable, problematic. Mm-hmm. And that was very clear under the Obama administration. I think what we're seeing now, and I think it's partly the result of the folks who felt that way were rather more successful than they anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like the guaranteed student loan program wiping out the private loan programs. This was during Obama. They never expected it to succeed. It did. And it was sort of the dog catching the car. Oops, now we got the student loan program. What do we do with it?
Yeah.
For-profit higher education is a fraction of what it once was. The large for-profit systems have pretty much all but disappeared. And it's important to understand who hasn't. Strategic education, which is a combination of Strayer University and Capella University, has prospered.
Mm-hmm.
Why? It has had virtually no regulatory problems. It has admirable student outcomes, graduation rates, placement rates, etc. So it is operated under the radar, so to speak, of the department looking for problems in higher education. And there are other models of that, but not many. And what's happened now is attention is now shifted to the broader higher education community and what is the effect of institutional mergers and how should the federal government and its proxies, accreditors and state authorizing agencies, manage those mergers. Now, I will say immediately that I think the complexities and the timeframes that are built into the new structures are excessively burdensome.
Mm-hmm. I would agree there.
I think the time to complete, the time to get out from under more restrictive regulations, such as limitations on adding new programs, are longer than necessary. But I think it's important that we look at why this is occurring. And the language that is being used by the department this is a quote from their news release, that the changes in the administration of the federal student loan and grant programs are intended to, quote, hold colleges accountable and protect students from unaffordable college debt.
Mm-hmm.
And what they are saying, and I've had this interpreted for me by numbers of folks, both inside and outside the administration, who are involved in this process. What they're really saying is we're less concerned about the mechanics, and we're more concerned about the outcome with regard to how well is an institution going to do its job? And its job being to educate and to graduate students who can then achieve their occupational, vocational, human goals. So there seems to be a shift towards looking at outcomes and the capacity to achieve outcomes as a way of measuring whether or not a merger is a good thing. First, starting off with what the parties look like. At the inception, are they good institutions? Are they quality institutions? Quality as in, what do their graduation rates look like? What do their outcomes, employment outcomes look like, where you can measure that? What is the persistence of students? What is the complaint rate? And what they're trying to parse is differentiating between schools that need to be supported and where a merger is going to make for a better institution, and schools where that shouldn't be supported. And perhaps the institution would be better off simply teaching out its students.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not explicit, but I'm reading that as implicit.
Mm-hmm. A question along those lines, with these new processes that are being put in place, which we're going to go into in just a moment, isn't that going to extend the time for a merger to take place? If you've got to get the departmental approval for the change of control, change of ownership, and then secondly, the approval of the integrated organization. If you've got an institution that is running out of cash, but still a good institution, doesn't that put that acquiree at risk?
The short answer is yes. I'm not at all sure that the people who put together the regulatory package have fully accounted for that additional burden. I don't think it's as severe as some have put it. There is now a hard 90-day period that you have to apply for a change of ownership prior to the closing date. That was not previously the case. As a matter of fact, you did not have to apply at all before the closing. As long as you filed your application for a change of ownership within 10 days of the closing having occurred. They've flipped that. But given the timeframes that the accreditors require for review and approval of a change of control, which is typically 6 to 9 months, that's probably not going to have as severe an effect as one might think. Now, what it does do, it forces the institutions to move more quickly in terms of getting to the point of having everything in place so that they can make an application to the Department of Education. But I don't think anybody has contemplated that you can do an institutional merger in under 3 months were it not for the Department of Education's rule. What they've done is they've said you've got to have it all in place with regard to the regulatory components 90 days in advance. Now, again, you don't have to have your approval by your accrediting agency. You just have to have that in advance of closing. Likewise, state authorization. But they're requiring that 90-day review period to give the department more of a chance to go in and look and say, are we happy with this? Are we happy with who the new leadership is going to be, what the new governance is going to be? Are there questionable people? They've increased the issue of scrutiny of disqualified people, disqualified control entities, and again, made that more of a forward-looking review rather than a backwards-looking review. So this is all going into what the department is thinking about is in terms of the integrity of the merged institution, but they're also looking at, is the merged institution going to have the financial wherewithal to be able to succeed, to be able to manage its student aid funds? And if that's questionable, the department has a fairly significant armature of things it can do to, in its view, protect the federal funds. And everything from requiring the posting of a letter of credit, which can be very simple in the case of a large, strong institution that makes an acquisition, to a deal killer in the case of smaller, weaker institutions.
St. Leo's, for example.
Exactly the example. If you've got to put up a substantial letter of credit to close and you can't do it, then the deal dies. Restriction on new programs, the rationale behind that is the department, and this has been in the books for a long time, the department wants to be able to see whether the new institution, the merged institution, can operate properly for a period of time before it expands. But a component of that has been rarely used, but may be used more often, is not just new programs, but also caps on enrollment growth.
Wow, that's huge.
And that has been rarely used. It's been used basically when there is a serious concern about either integrity or finances. And the question, and we don't know the answer to this, is to what extent is the department going to begin to rely on more burdensome restrictions while they satisfy themselves that all is well? And the problem with that is if a purpose of the merger is to be able to build out the merged institution so as to be more viable,
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying at the same time, that's great, but by the way, you can't add programs and you can't add students. To the extent that that's actually implemented, that's going to have a clear negative effect on a lot of these merges that are premised on being able to reverse enrollment decline. If you say, we're going to peg you at where you are at merger, and that is a point at which there was already a lack of viability, and you're restricting growth away from that, that's very risky. Now, we have no idea how that's going to play out. One of the things that's important here is that there are certain regulatory requirements, the 90-day rule, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But so much of what the department is putting into play is discretionary, is a wide range of discretion being given to the people who run federal student aid. And they're by and large not political, which is not to say that they don't have a social view, which they do. And these are folks who've been in federal student aid for a very, very long time across administrations. In a sense, the political people who were put over them are regarded by the folks who run the agency as summer help. They're going to be there and then they're going to be gone and someone else is going to be there. But it's not to say that the political folks can't make change. The dramatic change in accreditation that occurred towards the end of the Trump administration, when Diane Howard-Jones was the assistant secretary, has persisted and has tremendously changed the way the accreditors function, I think very much to the better. It's made accreditation much more willingness to be innovative and much more willingness to look at new models and new approaches.
I agree.
But there is an institutional persistence. But I think what they're also doing, and this is the new round of rulemakings, is putting more pressure on the accreditors to use a stronger microscope in looking at and in approving mergers and digging deeper into the institutions. It looks like they're going to go the same way with regard to the state authorizing agencies in raising higher expectations with regard to state level review. The department has tried to impose that on the states in the past, and it has failed miserably.
Mm-hmm.
There was the state post-secondary review entities that the Department of Education tried to create in the 90s that went down in flames. But I think there is this overall sense that fundamental institutional changes, mergers, acquisitions, joining together of institutions, need to be reviewed far more closely, far more intensely than has been the case in the past. Whether that is justified is questionable. I think there's an overreach in terms of what they're doing. But again, the rationale is we want to weed out the failing institutions. And the definition of failing institutions is institutions that are failing its students. That's different. And that's going to, I think, create a different calculus.
Yeah. Will this do that?
Yes and no. I think it is going to prevent some mergers involving the weak institutions, including some that, had they been allowed to go forward, would have had a positive outcome for the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, but with a perverse effect in some cases. Is it going to significantly improve student outcomes across higher education? I am highly doubtful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just real quickly, because we're getting to the end of our time, the neg-reg guidance that's going on right now, having to do with accreditors and with the state authorization, NC-SARA. What's your read on that?
The department and the people who are advising the department don't like the accreditors. They view the accreditors as not quite rubber stamps, but certainly not as aggressive guardians. And they want to push the accreditors to be more aggressively looking at institutions. They want the accreditors to be more independent of the institutions. The department just issued its position paper on the state authorization reciprocity agreement and the administration of NC SARA. And in full disclosure, I was recently elected to be a member of the NC SARA Board of Governors. And they are looking, interestingly, to increase the role of the states in the leadership of NC SARA, viewing NC SARA as purely a consumer protection agency, as a surrogate for the individual states in terms of consumer protection and ensuring that the rights of students are protected ultimately by a state consumer agency, by a state attorney general. And they have specific proposals that saying that the public members of NC SARA should essentially not have connections with the institutions that are the NC SARA members. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's like saying accrediting agencies should not have on their commissions the institutions that are accredited.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's indicative of a belief that institutions are firmly in support of reduced oversight and reduced consumer protection, and anything they can do to avoid that is what they want, and that they need to be pushed back from the table. I think that's wrong. I think it's counterproductive because the whole premise of SARA, of reciprocity, is that the institutions all agree and the accreditors all agree and the states all agree to a common standard and common mechanisms. And you can't take one leg out of that tripod and say, we're fine, we're going to manage this process. It's like airline regulation and taking the airlines out of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be a full partnership. So I think it's all of a piece of unfortunately, a distrust of higher education generally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part of that was brought on by higher education itself over the years.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the pendulum here is swinging way too far. I think ultimately, I don't think that SARA is going to be dramatically changed. Remember, the department, SARA is not a federal agency. It is an agreement among the states with the institutions, with the regional compacts. It's for them to agree.
Mm-hmm.
The Department of Education can determine not to recognize SARA and say that institutions have to get individual state recognition if they want to do that.
That won't happen.
That I would very much, politically, I would very, very much doubt that will occur. I think the pressure on the accreditors is consistent, but I think the accreditors are responding by virtue of their willingness to be open to more innovative, more student-centered approaches, is going to really, in a very significant way, immunize them against, the worst kinds of attacks.
Well, we certainly hope so. Mike, this has been fascinating, as always. I always enjoy our conversations. 3 takeaways for presidents and boards.
Number one, if your school can benefit from either merging with or being acquired by or acquiring another institution in terms of its educational mission, in terms of its service to broader communities, in terms of its finances, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever not to proceed. Number 2 is proceed with caution. Choose your partners very carefully. Make sure that they are additive to each other. 2 failing institutions that merge simply creates one larger failing institution. But 2 institutions that can benefit from scale, that can benefit from management, that can benefit from a mix of programs, adding graduate programs to an undergraduate institution, for example. That should certainly be considered and promoted. And finally, do it right, do it carefully, have the right professional guidance. It is not a game for amateurs. There are very sophisticated legal issues. There are very sophisticated financing issues. There are very sophisticated academic issues that need to be taken into account to surmount all of the hurdles that are out there. All that together, one can look at the higher education landscape and see dozens, perhaps hundreds over the years of successful institutional mergers. And I think the good models need to be the models for how we go forward.
Absolutely. What's next, Mike? What's next for you? What's next for Titan? What's next for us? Because we've got a very nice relationship and we work together.
Well, the what next is what happens on January 20th, 2025, because everything we're talking about right now could be turned on its head or continued. I think we have to look at what the Congress does with regard to changes in federal student aid policy as opposed to regulation. One thing that I do want to touch on, which is one of the really, really important things, is a bipartisan bill that is now going through the House for short-term Pell.
Yes.
8 to 15-week programs eligible for full Pell at any kind of accredited institution, for-profit, nonprofit, or public. That is potentially one of the greatest changes in workforce development, in improving the ability of Americans to gain the education and training that they need, that we have seen since perhaps the commencement of Title IV. Because not only is that going to allow individuals to get short training, to learn skills and to upgrade their skills, but it also will be a feeder into longer programs, ultimately into degree programs. So that's a huge breakthrough if that in fact is both authorized and then if funds are appropriated for it.
Let's keep our fingers crossed on that one. That one's really important.
Indeed.
Mike, again, thank you for being on the program. Always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, and I look forward to the next time.
Drumm, a real pleasure. See you soon.
See you. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Mike Goldstein of Titan Partners and for his sharing his views on the new regulations from the Department on mergers in higher education and the upcoming neg-reg process and its impact on accreditors and state authorization. Thanks, Mike. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. Tune in next week when we welcome Justin Grimes, founder and CEO of Apply to Graduate School, who will be joining us to talk about how to turn around enrollment for graduate schools through using strategic enrollment management and keeping it simple and real. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.